Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today it is the 19th of October, and today we're going to look at several parts of the front line, beginning with Vuhledar. We'll look briefly at a changeover there, but I want to focus most of the video on a really large Russian advance on the eastern bank of the Vovcha River. We'll also, of course, look at Maximilianivka, where the Russians continue to push forward. There are conflicting reports and a lot of footage now coming out of the Oskil River front, so we'll look at that. And we'll finish off by getting into some additional footage covering events in the Kursk region. And regarding what's going on with the measuring tool, I'm going to try to look for a good add-on that I could utilize instead of having to use the edit mode of my map in order to then get rid of the left side control panel. And hopefully that will improve the viewing experience going forward. But I do want to begin with Vuhledar, as I said, because there is just a slight advance, and you can see it amounts in this yellow polygon to 1.45 square kilometers. This is just a Russian continued push through a lot of these open fields that are no longer contested by the Ukrainians, in the sense that any forward operating squads, they're not actually coalescing around here. There's really no impetus to do so, because you have this large swath of territory that is in between the line of contact in the area where the Ukrainians actually do have their organization points in Vozvizhenka or Novoukrainka. If you're going to measure it, then it's actually like 6-7 kilometers away. There really aren't that many large trenches in between. There are tree lines that some of them are suffering damage now from shelling, and then very sparsely placed dugouts or trenches that simply don't have the density needed or the size in order to house a large amount of forces. So then the Russians, they don't even need that many. They just need a small armored assault to push forward in certain areas that are in the gray zone. And the biggest fear isn't encountering Ukrainian soldiers. It's more so whether the Ukrainian drone crews are noticing it in time and targeting those Russian advances. And so that's why sometimes it takes more time to see the Russians push through certain areas, but they definitely are making an effort to coalesce around here, and they're doing so along a ridge because, again, we've looked at the elevation here very closely. Vuhledar, especially the northern part of the village, it sort of extends northwestwards with a ridge, and that ridge pushes into the hinterlands that I'm marking with this red arrow, and then it sort of simmers out around the eastern portions of Novoukrainka. By the time you reach that village, it's already on low elevation. And so the Russian forces have a very clear path through here to push along areas that are not really defended well by the Ukrainians and are actually on a hill that could overlook this village and also provide a flank and an overlooking position of Vozvizhenka and, of course, of all the roads that connect these villages together. Now, to look at Maximilianivka, we have two pieces of footage to confirm some of the reports from yesterday coming out from Russian sources that they were able to take the entirety of the village and also expand significantly in the fields to the south of that village. And you can see that over here with this video that I'm going to click on. It's from October 19th. It's from the 46th Air Mobile Brigade. They conducted defensive activities in coordination with the 33rd Mechanized Brigade. 33rd Brigade really is known for its vast array of NATO weaponry, whether it be infantry fighting vehicles or tanks that came in from the West in the early parts of 2023. It was also trained, a lot of its forces were trained in Western countries. And so really its sector of responsibility usually was the region in between Maximilianivka to Konstantinivka, especially around Pobieda. And now it's taking a more significant focus on an area a few kilometers north, and is involved in the defensive actions in conjunction with at least one battalion of the 46th Brigade. And also one battalion of the 79th Air Assault Brigade is supposed to be operating around here. And so they're actually involved in the house-to-house fighting that was going on in Maximilianivka. So Ukrainian sources mentioned that there was an attack today with 2 tanks and 3 armored vehicles. They advanced along this highway that I claimed was under Russian control yesterday. And at this point, it's become pretty likely, given the fact that they were able to make it here this deep into the open fields. And at that point, they took a detour and they began storming some of the tree lines over here. And that's really the goal, to create a permanent Russian settlement, dismount troops from those armored vehicles, and then the tanks are supposed to, of course, provide the heavy fire supports. So the geolocations show how the Ukrainian vehicles were able to coordinate the response to that, and they destroyed one tank due to the 33rd Brigade tank destroying it directly with its own fire, and then another tank was destroyed due to mines, and all the footage for that is over here. Actually, the mine didn't destroy a tank, but it destroyed an armored vehicle. But in any case, it shows that there was damage caused. But then the other thing is Not all of the armored vehicles were destroyed, and so likely they had the ability to dismount forces, and those squads are now operating in these forested regions and could begin expanding. And the goal would be to create the framework to then storm these two lines of Ukrainian defense. Because you see it over here, there are two tree lines that are basically run diagonally, and they are really dense. They're concentrated. Of course, the flanks aren't really well protected, but if you're going to try to break through along the highway, then you need to secure these two lines. And so now the Russians are really laying the groundwork for that by having troops nearby and also by moving closer and closer with certain amounts of vehicles that could directly fire towards those positions. More generally, the Ukrainians claimed they saw two Russian infantry platoons involved in assaults today in the sector. So that could include, of course, the assaults over here. And then you would see that there would be at the very least several dozens of troops operating in this region, this field. If you're looking at the elevation for that, as I talked about in yesterday's video, you have a sort of hilly area over here marked in X, an area that the Ukrainians control and is generally in the domain of the 33rd Brigade. And so from a geographic perspective, the defenses here are relatively strong, and also the line of contact is protected by several layers of defenses, with the weak point being over here, just north of Konstantinivka. On a side note, some Russian sources are claiming today, and this is still unconfirmed, that they are storming the center of Katerianivka. And so we'll wait for reporting on that. We'll talk about it tomorrow if it ends up materializing. Now, besides that, you have this lower lying region that runs along this gully. Of course, that makes sense, and it's also a really good area for placing troops, just simply because of the foliage over there that provides protection. Then northwards along the highway, this is actually on a higher elevation and leads directly into Kurakhove from the south. The highway also gives the Russians access to the vast array of trenches that were built on the perimeter of Kurakhove. And these defenses are completely untested. We have not seen yet how the Ukrainians will withstand direct Russian assaults onto these defenses. We just have no idea as to the, how long they'll be able to hold on. But you can see that based on the satellite imagery, there are very large amounts of layers that go around most of the perimeter. You can see that especially in the southern perimeter and also to the west. To the east, there are a few regions that are a bit more exposed. They're very narrow routes, and so then it becomes dangerous to only advance through those particular regions, but there is the option to do so. One region would be through Ostrivska, which is right next to the river directly. Another one would be through just some of the paved roads, including this one over here, Centralna Road, that has an entrance. It's adjacent to a trench, but the trench isn't like on either side. It's only on one side, and so theoretically you could also push through there. But again, you're looking at a region where Ukrainian forces could definitely coalesce in a scenario where the outskirts are taken over by the Russians. To zoom in and look at the other area where the Russian infantry platoon advanced, that would be over here, taking over 1.72 square kilometers in western Maximilianivka. It's also been admitted by Ukrainian sources that the Russians were not just in the center of the village, but that they likely have taken over most, if not all, of the town, and that Ukrainian forces are, at the very least operating over here, if not operating even further westwards. And this would be this like small dacha commune or whatever, and there are some houses and basements over there. So again, that's one of the final roadblocks for the Russian forces as they make their way along this paved route into the eastern outskirts of Kurakhove directly. So in terms of an advance by the Russian forces at a maximum, it would include 1.6 kilometers, and the Russians did not just take over positions in houses, but also in some higher elevated regions that I'm marking here with an X, and also some lower elevated regions located over here that have some foliage surrounding them. And you can see that based on footage here of the 46th Air Assault Brigade hitting two tanks, and this is just a drone compilation video. It's not clear whether the tanks were actually hit, or rather, my bad. There are two tanks. One of them was definitely hit. You could see that actually as a turtle tank protection. Really well protected tank, and you could see it crossing the gardens. Then another one, the feed cut out before you could see where it landed. But then you also have FPV strikes more generally onto houses where you could see that there were Russian soldiers operating. So that's the confirmation. Now to look at the Vovcha River, here you have a really important advance, and I'm projecting that it amounts to 12 square kilometers based on geolocation that I'm clicking on over here. It's a FPV compilation video from the 21st Presidential Brigade Battalion. So Presidential Brigade is split up. We've talked about it before with Velika Novosilka because two of its battalions are operating around there. And then the 21st Battalion specifically is the only part of this unit that is operating in the Vovcha River sector. and it's accompanied certain units like the 59th Brigade in Kurakhove for a very long time, for several months, without that much of a rotation ability. And they've also been involved in the large-scale retreats in recent months for the summer, all the way to the river itself, to the eastern bank. And at this point, the Russians have been able to push them out entirely from certain portions of the riverbank, and that would include the eastern side of Zoriane. So Zoriane is a village that is largely west of the river, including near Kurakhove and Hirnik, but then you have this sort of outcropping of it over here marked with this red rectangle, and the Russian forces were able to enter into it. Now, we don't know from which direction. There was a feasible scenario where it was done through Zelana Druche, but it is not. That is also not really conducive to the Ukrainian side, because the implication would be that the Russians were able to take over that village as well, and then advance along the vertical road into this small district. I don't know about that. So I don't want to project that a village fell without confirming. So for now, I'm just marking the fields to the east were taken over by the Russians. And the Russians just cleared these areas where you don't have a dense amount of fortifications, and were able to then storm into the houses directly without that much Ukrainian resistance, because it is a really small, concentrated area, and sort of prolong the defense over there really isn't possible given how extended this particular location is from the main nucleus of Ukrainian defense in Donetsk. Because look at it, the Vovcha River is on a salient east of course, the western bank, and then the western bank is also in a salient that is, within the general frame of the southern Donetsk or eastern Donetsk front. And so it really is just so disconnected from where most of the Ukrainian operations and defense and command and control is. So definitely, yeah, it is hard to hold on to for a long period of time. What it means is that the Russians have access to three routes, actually. One route going southwards to clear Alexandropol. You can see that over here. And now the pressure on that village will really begin to exacerbate. Besides that, you also have a direct passage through this bridge to enter into Zoriana itself. There are some trench systems on its entrance over here and also to the north, but it's not anything too significant. So really the main force that will be holding back the Russians are just Ukrainian troops that retreated and are still holding over here. That would include, of course, 21st Battalion, 108th Mechanized Battalion, other elements of the 59th Brigade, for instance. And you can see that they are very active with their FPV strikes, as was shown in that clip. And then also there's the route leading to Zelana Druche, because the Russian forces are now engaged in the final clearing operations of this bank. And then the focus will shift, first of all, to Kurakhove. More resources will be able to be moved in this direction. That will include from the 150th Motor Rifle Division and from the 5th Upload Motor Rifle Brigade. But then also you'll have the Russians begin to shift focus to crossing over the river and putting pressure onto eastern Hirnik. Eastern Hirnik is an area that is not well defended. As we said, the fall of Zoriana would really entail an open path for the Russian forces on what would become eventually similar elevation to put pressure onto a node, onto a city that is already under a lot of stress from other directions. If you're looking at Hirnik, Ukrainian sources have reported recently an uptick in Russian artillery, so it's being bombarded more heavily right now, and DRG activity has once again increased on the northern outskirts. So definitely the Russians are trying to spread out the Ukrainians and maximize damage as they approach from the east as well. So that's something to definitely keep an eye on. And again, also look at the movements near Novoselivka, Izmailivka. Russian forces, if they're able to sense a gap, then they'll definitely try to create a situation not where they're successful in encircling, because, of course, in any sort of scenario of an impending encirclement, as we've seen before, the Ukrainians would have enough time to get out, but it really would force their hand and force them to leave certain areas that actually could be really protracted in their defense, like Kurakhove, like these quarries and landfills, like the industrial areas in Hirnik, would force their hand to leave earlier, and that would reduce Russian casualties and allow them to take over additional land. Now, looking northeast of Pokrovsk, it's not actually north, it's more so just east, and it's northwest of Chernihiv. That's how I've always associated this part of the front line. You have an interesting Russian advance in an area that has simply been quiet recently, just south of Vozvizhenka. So we talked about, I think it was like late spring, early summer, this Russian push that came in from Novoalexandrivka, and they advanced along a very narrow, concentrated route towards Vozvizhenka. And it sort of died out, it petered out, not only because of the dense fortifications the Ukrainians have here and because of their successful defense, but because the priorities shifted elsewhere and the Russians were capitalizing on advances that were occurring further to the southwest. So it was understandable. But that doesn't change the fact that the underlying elevation dynamics here could have been taken advantage of by the Russian forces. And I mentioned that time and time again. when the Russians were actually pushing forward here, what could be the potential objective. You have this really important ridge, this ridge that runs east of this chain of villages and this like pond region. And it's also east of a large fortification system that you see over here, and of course the highway that feeds directly into Pokrovsk and Murorod. So this is an area that's exposed in the sense that it's not well defended. It's an open field, so it's good for armored assaults that would come in from a Cheratina. And then it also overlooks regions to the west and to the east. In the east, you have a very strong Ukrainian defense node, not necessarily in terms of the brigades operating there, but just in terms of the fortifications that would be struck. And so I always thought that it was a good course of action for the Russians to advance through this area, but simply there wasn't the impetus to do so. Also, you have, in relation to Vozvizhenka, a distance from that village of about, let's see, like 4 or 5 kilometers before you reach the Donetsk ring road. That ring road is important because it still is being utilized by the Ukrainians, even though it's, of course, well within the range of Russian artillery. If you're looking at the closest extent, the Russians are only about 5 kilometers away, as we said. And so definitely even short-range artillery that's east of the Vovcha River is firing onto this area, but it could still physically be utilized by the Ukrainians. So there is still a lot of good reason to cut it off physically. And then you also have the fact that it connects between not just Pokrovsk, but more generally connects to other cities in the Dnipro region and in western Donetsk, and makes it all the way to key cities like Kostiantynivka, and then from there feeds it to regions like New York. So it's actually more than just Pokrovsk itself, where there's actual battles going on, but it's also about other sectors in Donetsk that are also seeing heavy fighting right now in the east. So yeah, based on the footage, you can see it over here. You have the Russians raising a flag near an outpost. So there's actual houses that they took over, but not the entire village. It's a very small village, so the fighting there will really be concentrated. So you'll see some large destruction proportionally. And in the process, the Russians took over this trench system. If you're looking at the units operating around here, you have territorial defense units, you have this rifle battalion, you may have certain elements of the National Guard, and perhaps the 110th Mechanized Brigade. Haven't heard much from them recently, so they have been in a process of operating in a front that is less intense, or maybe just being completely arrested. We don't know exactly, but they are located in a really strong point because this region in between the line of contact in the highway is actually on high elevation, and it's dense in terms of trenches. And that could also be a part of why the Russians were disincentivized from advancing and putting all of their forces into that one region. Now, to look at Kharkiv, you're going to see once again that the center of fighting is around Kurakhove. Once again, footage is being released by the Ukrainians that goes against their narrative of what's going on in this village. And of course, there is the claim that the footage is older, and that's something that can't be fully proven one way or another. And so until we see proof otherwise to indicate that the Ukrainians have retaken these portions of the village, then I'm going to just go based off of the video evidence and show that the Russians are advancing in this region. So here you can see a video that was released on October 19th. It shows over 17 Russian vehicles attacking towards Kurakhove. So you're seeing an uptick in the scale of the Russian attacks, because originally they were in smaller sizes, although still significant, and it's a mix always of tanks and BMPs. And they were able to make it into this region of Kurakhove, near the warehouses and near some of the outskirts. And this video, it's different because the Russian forces were able to make it in several hundred meters further to the west, cut off actually the rail route. Of course, the Ukrainians are not using rail, but there are well-established paths along that rail line, including windbreaks that the Ukrainian soldiers utilize on a daily basis. So now the Russians actually cut off that route. So any sort of eastern bank coordination that is ongoing between the northern part near Kupiansk and the southern part near, these villages that you see on my screen is being done through this very, very narrow corridor that is just on a floodplain, essentially. So the footage that we're talking about, it was released based on joint coordination between the 1st National Guard Brigade, the 77th Air Mobile Brigade, and the Achilles drone unit of the 92nd Assault Brigade. Achilles drone unit is also very active right now with the Lipsy sector. So it's interesting to see that they're also operating around here. They said during the assault that they were able to create damage to 17 vehicles. That's why I said 17 plus vehicles were involved in the attack, because definitely there were more than 17 more generally. And included in that number are 8 BMPs and 3 tanks destroyed by the Ukrainians and 6 BMPs that were damaged. Those are their claims, and a lot of them can be corroborated based on the footage, but not all of them. It's also clear that based on the amount of BMPs that the Russians intended to dismount their forces in these houses, which they ended up doing, as can be shown in the footage, and taking up positions in these houses to push forward and take it over completely. And according to the Ukrainian side, they were able to kill 21 Russian soldiers and wound 26. Regardless of that number, it does indicate that the scale of the attack was in the dozens. So several platoons actually of Russian soldiers may have been involved. And it's all through this one axis, this one really effective axis, the Pischana flower, pushing westwards, and at this point getting control over another polygon of 0.6 square kilometers. So as I've been reiterating, it's really of the utmost importance for Ukrainian coordination to ensure that they are not cut off in this region. But really, in effect, you don't see that much coordination between North and South anymore. It's also about the fact that the Russians will have access now to pushing along the chain of villages along the Oskil River and threaten a lot of other villages that should be considered on the rear, but they're going to actually be flanked from regions that were not expected based on where the defenses were built. So there really are a whole host of implications, both in terms of logistics, like the bridges across the Oskil River, also for the flanks of Ukrainian frontline positions that are way, way further to the east. If we're measuring it, they're probably like 12 kilometers away. They're going to be under threat because their supply lines are going to be threatened along that chain of villages. So all of that has to be taken into account. And now looking at the Kursk region, the Russians were able to advance in Ruska Konopelka. I talked about Russian sources reporting on this yesterday, but I did not change the map because there was no confirmation. Now there actually is, because you have the 156th Battalion of the 118th Territorial Defense Brigade. They released footage of them attempting to strike two vehicles, and they were advancing originally along this rail axis, then made a detour to the east and pushed along the open fields. And essentially the implication is that the entirety of Ruska Konopelka is under Russian control. It's really unclear whether the vehicles were damaged, so I can't say definitively, but it does also indicate they refer to their presence here, and that means that Ruska Konopelka is no longer a forward operating base for the Ukrainians. As I explained numerous times right now, the Ukrainians understood that to protract the fighting east of Suja, to prevent it from making it into the town itself, they needed to get control over several perimeter rings. So they were able to get control over one, which is between Martinovka and Komakov, and of course everything in between. And from there, they had the groundwork established to attack eastwards towards Pushkarnoy and Rusko Konopelka, as we said before, and also more generally the forested regions here and the ravines. So they made several pushes, including this one over here with the salient, and then also into Ruskaya. And really the fighting dragged out over there. They were not able to finish the job, as you say. And the Russian forces moved in additional reinforcements from Akhmat or 810th Naval Infantry or Territorial Motor Rifle Regiments, all of them organized around here and conducted successful counterattacks as they built up forces also to the south near the Borky region. And that will also, of course, threaten Plokhovo, which is also experiencing a lot of pressure right now. And as a result, the Russian forces have been able to prevent the Ukrainians from getting control over a second ring of perimeter, which means that this chain of villages and this region, this forward axis, will serve as a spearhead to push directly eastwards towards the outskirts of Suja from this particular direction, in addition to what's going on further to the northwest, which is also really threatening to Suja, although not in the immediate moment, but of course it will become clear in the future. Now, in regards to the Snagost River region and, of course, south of Zeleny Shlaich, it's becoming more and more clear that the Ukrainians have withdrawn from several villages. And I've reiterated this in several videos now, but I've not been able to make conclusive changes to the map because we didn't actually see video proof of the Russians entering. But we do have, at the very least, video proof of the Ukrainians leaving, which is why I'm extending the gray zone. So I think it's this video over here. It's from October 18th, but probably a lot of the videos, because there's 4 videos attached, are from earlier on, maybe from October 16th, around that time period. And you can see Russians grenade drops onto several Ukrainian soldiers, but the main point is that you have Russian reconnaissance drones observing over 30 Ukrainian soldiers from a single platoon retreating southwards. And there are several clips, and you don't know if all of them are of the same platoon because they vary in size very slightly. But it does indicate that there have been large-scale withdrawals occurring over the past few days from this region, and that a lot of it happened either through Zeleny Shlaich directly, or you had Ukrainian forces from Krovsky and Tolstoy Lug then actually make the detour eastwards and then begin their journey along this highway over here. So they would have a definitive route that is not in a exposed area, you could say, like over here, along the highway all the way to Sverdlikovo, because Sverdlikovo is actually an area where you do have a large Ukrainian rear post. I don't even think you could call it a rear anymore, because it is, if we're measuring it right now. If we're being generous with the Ukrainians, only about 5 kilometers away from their forward positions. But in any case, in the drone drops that we actually saw in the video, it wasn't really enough to show any casualties. But you can see that there are large groups of forces, and that's something that's not consistent with a localized movement. That is clearly a much broader change in terms of the location of soldiers from several brigades, including 80th, 82nd, 95th Air Assault Brigades, and then also the 103rd Territorial Defense Brigade, perhaps even elements of the 41st Mechanized Brigade that were defending further northwards, not necessarily in Novo-Ivanovka, but in areas like Kremyannoy, Pogrebki, etc. They may have also been forced to move out of this. But so far, not enough confirmation to change anything with this northern Kursk salient, so we're going to keep an eye out for that. And then in regards to the retreating footage, there's footage of several incidents where you have large groups of Ukrainian soldiers, over 20 in each video, moving through open fields, actually moving from tree line to tree line. So they examine the open regions next to the tree lines to ensure that they're not under some sort of Russian fire or surveillance, and then they just begin to move discreetly. And so you can see there is a Ukrainian movement definitely along this highway towards Sverdlikovo, for instance. And as this continues to manifest itself and the Russians begin to move in carefully, then that's when I'll be able to make the definitive changes with a yellow polygon. And so that's all I have for today. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.